Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're doing more than just a history lesson. We're going to deconstruct how a nation was literally forged in the fires of 333 years of colonial rule.
So, let's unpack over 3 centuries of Spanish influence in the Philippines. This was a time that completely transformed the archipelago, shaping its politics, its society, and its very identity.
All right, here's our game plan. We'll start with those first Spanish ships, look at life under colonial control, dive into the long history of resistance, and finally, witness the birth of the Philippine Revolution.
So, first things first, what brought the Spanish all the way across the world? Well, their motives are famously summed up by the 3 Gs: God, their mission to spread Christianity; gold, the hunt for wealth and spices; and glory, the quest for fame and empire.
It all kicked off in 1521. Ferdinand Magellan's expedition makes landfall in Samar, and he names the islands Las Islas de San Lázaro. A really pivotal moment happens soon after. The first Catholic Mass is held, with local leaders like Raja Colombo and Raja Siagu. You can see how these early encounters, this mix of diplomacy and religion, really set the stage for everything that followed.
But hey, this arrival wasn't exactly welcomed with open arms everywhere. The Spanish were immediately met with fierce resistance, most famously from Lapu-Lapu, the chieftain of Mactan. His forces actually defeated Magellan's, and in doing so, Lapu-Lapu goes down in history as the first Filipino hero for resisting foreign colonization.
It actually took another 4 decades, but by 1565, Spain was there to stay. Under Miguel López de Legazpi, they established permanent control, renamed the islands Las Islas Filipinas, and started building a rigid structure to control every single part of life.
Politically, it was a classic top-down hierarchy. You had the King of Spain at the very top. But because the Philippines was so incredibly far away, it was actually administered through the Viceroyalty of New Spain in Mexico. This is what created that famous galleon trade route between them. And on the ground in the Philippines, the guy with all the power was the Governor General, though his authority was, at least in theory, checked by courts like the Royal Audiencia.
This political control was perfectly mirrored in the social structure. Think of it as a rigid pyramid, a racial caste system built to keep the Spanish on top. Right at the peak were the Peninsulares, Spaniards born in Spain. Just below them, the Insulares, still full-blooded Spaniards, but born in the colony. And way down at the bottom were the Indios, the term they used for the native Filipino population. This wasn't just about social status. It decided your legal rights, your job prospects, basically your entire life.
Now, to make the colony profitable, Spain rolled out several systems of economic exploitation. The most infamous was probably the polo y servicio, a really brutal system of forced labor. Filipino men were basically drafted to build everything from huge churches and military forts to the giant galleon ships for trade.
Let that number sink in for a second. 40 days. That's over a month, every single year, that men were ripped away from their own farms, their families, and their communities to do back-breaking labor, often miles from home. It wasn't just a tax on your time. This system completely dismantled local economies and, as you can imagine, bred a deep, deep resentment.
And if the forced labor wasn't enough, there was the bandala system. This basically forced farmers to sell their harvest to the government. They were given a quota they had to meet, but the government paid them ridiculously low prices, trapping them in a cycle of poverty and debt.
Perhaps the most twisted system was the encomienda. On paper, it sounded almost noble. A grant of land where a Spanish encomendero was supposed to protect the people and teach them Christianity. But in reality, it gave these men near absolute power, leading to horrific abuses and turning free people into what were essentially slaves on their own land.
Now, with all these oppressive systems in place, you can bet they did not go unchallenged. For over 300 years, the story of Spanish rule is also the story of Filipino resistance. Revolts were constantly erupting all across the islands. And the reasons for these uprisings were all over the map. Some, like the Templat Revolt, were about religion, a desire to go back to their native beliefs. But many, many others, like the one led by Diego Silong, were a direct response to those economic abuses, the forced labor, the unfair taxes, and the bandala system.
If you want to understand just how stubborn this resistance was, get this. The revolt led by Francisco Dagohoy in Bohol lasted for 85 years. Nope, that is not a typo. 85 years. We're talking about a multi-generational struggle for freedom in just one part of the country. It's just a powerful reminder of how deep the opposition to Spanish rule really ran.
Okay, so as we get into the 1800s, something starts to change. All these scattered local revolts start to connect. A new feeling emerges, a sense of a shared Filipino identity, and it transforms the resistance into a true nationalist movement.
And there's one single event that's often seen as the spark that lit the fuse, the Cavite Mutiny of 1872. After a failed uprising, 3 Filipino priests, Gomez, Burgos, and Zamora, known together as Gomburza, were publicly and unjustly executed. Their martyrdom became a national rallying cry, sending shockwaves across the colony and igniting the flame of real Filipino nationalism.
So this new nationalism took 2 main forms. First, you had the propaganda movement, led by intellectuals like José Rizal, who hoped for peaceful reforms through their writings. But when that didn't work, the Katipuan was born. This was a secret society, led by Andres Bonifacio, that came to a different conclusion. The only way to get freedom was through armed revolution. And even inside the Katipuan, you had deep divisions, especially between Bonifacio and Emilio Aguinaldo, a conflict that would tragically shape the revolution's path.
Ultimately, the Katipunan's call for revolution is what took hold. Their secret society was discovered in 1896, which forced their hand and launched a nationwide fight for independence, maybe a little sooner than they'd planned.
The revolution exploded with a coordinated uprising in these 8 provinces right around Manila. And you know what? These provinces are still honored today. They're represented by the 8 rays of the sun you see on the Philippine flag.
And here's the amazing part. Against all odds, the revolution worked. It all led up to the 1898 Declaration of Independence and the creation of the Morelos Constitution. This established the first Philippine Republic, which was a massive deal. It was the very first constitutional republic in all of Asia, with Emilio Aguinaldo as its first president.
So, let's wrap this all up. Spain's 333-year rule completely reshaped the islands, but their colonial systems, built on oppression, fueled centuries of resistance. And that resistance grew from small uprisings into a unified nationalist movement that, in the end, created Asia's very first republic.
All right, time for a quick knowledge check. Based on what we've just covered, how many of these can you answer? Go ahead and pause here to see how much you remember about this crucial period.
Of course, the story didn't end there. The Spanish-American War would soon bring in a new colonial power. But the legacy of Spain, well, it's undeniable. It's baked into the language, the dominant religion, and the very culture of the modern Philippines. And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. Where else do you see the echoes of these 333 years today?